All right, welcome back to Clearwater Jazz Holidays Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions. We're here with Alejandro Arenas, and his topic today is musical composition, approaches, and ideas. We are recording these sessions for the purposes of Clearwater Jazz Holidays education and outreach. Please send all of your feedback and questions and suggested topics to info@clearwaterjazz.com. Visit our education and outreach section to see all of the upcoming sessions and Zoom information to join those sessions, and take a look at the new studio resource and the Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions podcast, where you can find all of the past video recordings and audio of all of these wonderful sessions. Those are brought to you by Blue Water Wealth Management at Steward Partners and Marine Max Clearwater. We appreciate that great support. And we always give a big shout out to the Al Downing Tampa Bay Jazz Association for helping to support this particular initiative, including today's session with Alejandro. Before I get into Alejandro's background, I wanted to say, Alejandro, I was able to see some of the live feed from your somewhat recent CD release party for Everybody Wants to Rule the World. I thought that was fantastic. How did you think that went?
Oh, we had a blast. It's always odd without a live audience. We certainly miss playing in front of live audiences a lot, but it's also kind of cool to be able to reach a wider audience through streaming. Because we had some people logging in from cities that we've never even been to, so that's been really good. And we've been charting. I think today we are at number 14 in the national jazz charts with the album. I think this is our 5th or 6th week that we've been charting, so we're very, very happy with that.
Yeah, I've been following along, and I just think it's awesome. Of course, we're talking about La Lucha, and thank you all for continuing to create and share your gift and talent with the world. It's some really good stuff. In fact, today, to get into the zone, I was coming back from some outreach sessions this morning, driving over the Gandy Bridge back to Tampa, and I was listening to the CD. There's one song on it that I keep gravitating to, and I don't know if I'm going to say it right, but I think it's one of your compositions called Lilis or Lilis.
Lilis, yeah, Lilis.
Lilis. So, what is that? Is that a family name?
Yes, it is actually the nickname for my daughter. And the funny story behind that song is that it's a little. I came up with the idea of the song as I was practicing while she was taking a nap. So I dedicated it to her. And her name is Amelie, and somehow we always grew up names in our family, and somehow it ended up at Lily's. So that's why it doesn't have the E like the flower. It's.
Yeah, that's great. That's great, and I don't know. I just think it's such a chill kind of. It's a wonderful little tune melody, and it's such a cool groove. And so I was coming over the bridge just listening to it, and I wanted to mention that to you. I think it's really, really great.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
The whole album is fantastic. So. If you are new to watching these sessions, Alejandro has done several of them that you can catch in the studio resource. There's a bass style series where he's done an approach to playing swing, funk, and more, an approach to playing Brazilian and Latin grooves. He did one more technical session called Bass Sound, from pickups and amps to technique and more. And then he helped launch the whole series with La Lucha, with a history of rhythm section focused collaboration among the artists. They're really, really good sessions, so check them out if you can. You can listen to them in the podcast or watch them in the studio. And he's got a couple upcoming sessions as well. One's called Harmony, a Bass Perspective, on August 25th, and another one's called Fun with Arranging, Reimagining Existing Composition, which is something he's very familiar with, and that is on September the 1st. So let me tell you a little bit about Alejandro. I'm going to turn it over to him. He was born in Colombia, where he started his musical career playing flamenco and classical guitar. He picked up the bass while he attended college in Bogota, where he performed in the salsa and Andean music ensembles as well as the school's orchestra. During his high school years, he performed with different independent bands with styles ranging from salsa, blues, rock, and heavy metal. Upon graduating high school, he moved to Gainesville, Florida. There, he worked as a freelance musician while being exposed to different genres such as reggae and jazz and funk. He earned his AA in music studies from Santa Fe Community College, where he worked unpacking books in the morning, studying during the day, and playing gigs at night. In the midst of all of this chaotic time in his life, he developed a deep love for jazz, which drove him to learn to play the upright bass. He holds a bachelor's of music in jazz performance and a master of music from the University of South Florida. During his studies at USF, he toured Italy, France, and Germany with the Jazz Ensemble One and the Jazz Tet, performing at different jazz festivals. In addition to being an adjunct professor for the Mira program at St. Pete College, Alejandro is very active as a versatile performer, working with many artists, and as we have discussed, he co-leads the award-winning group La Lucha. Alejandro, welcome back to our sessions. The stage is all yours, my friend.
Thank you, Steve. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about composition, and it's a topic that can be a little bit overwhelming because there's you can go to college and study composition and still not have a clear understanding of everything that goes into it. And what I mean by that is that you can ask any composer how their process to write, and you're going to get a lot of different answers because everybody approaches things differently. I think the most common misconception, or not misconception, but what a lot of people think happens when you write music is that you get inspired. The muse hits you and you start writing, and that's the only way to do it. And that's not necessarily the case, especially in the world today where we don't have patrons, paying us to compose necessarily. So there's a lot of composers have commissions that they have deadlines for, and they don't have time to get inspired. They just have to write. That's their job. So, a lot of the times you have to kind of figure out how to get to that point. I'm not like a huge commission composer or anything like that. I don't write for very many large ensembles or anything like that. But I write a lot of music, and I've been writing music since I started playing music. To me, the key to developing your sound was that. And as Steve mentioned at the beginning, with La Lucha, that's been a great workshop in order to be able to bring in compositions and work them out and learn a lot. Same thing in college. That's one of the great advantages of going to college. If you're a student going to college and you're in a combo, I strongly encourage you to bring music in for other people to play it, because you get feedback. You get a lot of things that may be hard to achieve without being around other musicians, especially, everybody's there doing the same thing. So for me, I'm a bass player. So one of the hardest things always, or has been, understanding another instrument I'm writing for, because as a bass player, I'm mostly an accompanist or a supportive instrument or providing the foundation. Not always, but that's kind of the perceived role of the instrument. And so sometimes I have to write for trumpet or saxophone or trombone, and I need to understand how those instruments work and how to approach writing for those instruments. By the same token, sometimes people give me music with stuff that's really difficult to play on the bass, because maybe they're a keyboard player or a sax player. They have different ways to approach their instrument that don't translate so well onto the bass. So those are things that are important to understand. So what I wanted to talk about today is a couple of techniques that I use, I don't want to call them tricks, but they're not tricks, but just my approach to writing some of the music that I do. For example, Steve mentioned earlier Lilies, which is a track of our most recent album, Everybody Wants to Rule the World. And that song really came about very quickly, and it was a perfect representation of one of the things that I do. Sometimes I'll get an idea. So this was actually, I was sitting down playing the bass, and I just played a little riff that I really liked, and eventually I wrote it out. Well, actually, what I did is I just took out my phone, I recorded the little riff, and I let it sit there. So then later, when I had more time, I went back to it, and I developed a whole melody based on that little nugget of information. Now, one thing that I try to do, sometimes that happens not just with my instrument, but sometimes I'll be at the most inconvenient place away from an instrument, and a melody will pop in my head. And I'm like, oh, this is something I could do something with. So I'll take out my phone, I'll just hum it or sing it onto it, and then come back to it later and see what I can do with it. So that I found that's a really cool way to approach things. I didn't used to write that way. I come from, as Steve mentioned in the bio, I really come from many different kind of genres, and especially I played a lot of rock early on. And a lot of rock kind of starts with riffs a lot of the time. So you have a chord pattern that you base it on. So it's almost more like you're starting from the bottom up in terms of you have a foundational groove, or chord progression. If you're writing on guitar, a lot of times it's a strumming thing, and then you build from there. You write a melody on top of that, and I try to start writing from the melody, starting with the melody. And the reason I do that is because the melody is kind of the strongest component of a composition. It's actually the one thing, along with lyrics, that you can actually copyright. So that was an exercise that somebody suggested to me. They said like, hey, why don't you write a melody with no context? So I said, okay, well, let me try to do that. And my first couple of experiments of that were a little bit harder, because being a rhythm section player, I always started thinking of the rhythm section first. So everything, I either started with a bass line, or it started with a groove or something like that, and then I started writing on top. Now, part of the stuff that I started realizing with that is that I was limiting myself, because when you have a melody, so let's say that, well, here's an example. I have a little keyboard here, it's not on camera, but I'm going to play one note. That's a C. Right now, there's no context for that C. What I mean by that is I'm just playing a single note, just a single repeated note. Now, when you add another note, you create harmony. So I'm going to add one note here, so it's going to be an A flat. Right? So that gives that note a particular sound all of a sudden. The combination of those two notes now creates like, oh, okay, now I'm going to play a different note. So I'm still holding the C on the melody at the top. Now another note. So I played an A flat first, then I moved to a G. Now I'm going to play a B flat on the left hand. Now I'm going to play another note. So even though I have the same note on the right hand, it's the same repeated melody, the combination of the two notes gives it a completely different sound. So I love playing with that idea, because then you can create so many different, you can change the context in which you present a melody. Even just taking three notes. Let's take that. So then I'm going to play with that A flat on my left hand. So even though it's the same repeated melody, just three notes, every time I change the left hand, it's putting a different context. And to my ear, it's kind of like one sounds more dramatic than the other. And then, of course, you talk about context now in the bigger picture, which is, okay, how does one phrase followed by the other note by the other phrase sound? So, you know, for example, that to me sounds very different from this. The second example I did sounded a little bit more dramatic, you know, to my ear. And again, composition is very subjective. You know, that's why we all like different music, because we like some music, we don't like some other music. So, you know, I've seen funny discussions of people online discussing who was a better songwriter, John Lennon or Paul McCartney. You know, it's like, what's the point to me, you know? But that's just me. It's saying, you know, they wrote so differently, and when they wrote together, they wrote some of the greatest songs of the 20th century. So they were obviously both fantastic songwriters in that style. A composer that I really like is Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys. And if you're not familiar with the album Pet Sounds, that's kind of my favorite Beach Boys album. It's kind of a cult classic in a way. It's kind of like an album that's become hip to like. That's not the reason I like it. I just really kind of dug into that album. And compositionally, he came up with this really kind of angular, weird melodies. And somehow he still managed to make them sound poppy. You know, which is it's a remarkable thing to do, because as a composer, what I always want to try to do is to create something that sounds somewhat familiar to the listener, but that it's also original. And that's one of the hardest things to achieve, because in music and in music in general, you only have a handful of chord progressions that are, or I mean, that's kind of a vast generalization, but it's hard. It's really easy to make certain predetermined chord progressions work. You know, if you listen to a lot of pop music, they share a lot of the same chord progression. The difference comes from the melody being different. It comes from a lot of things around it changing. You know, the key, the tempo, a lot of that stuff. Now, from the perspective of jazz, talking about jazz, of course, we have a lot more freedom with what we can do, both melodically and harmonically. Right, a lot of pop music, you know, is limited to certain quality of chords, whereas in jazz we have all of these very colorful chords that allow us to do certain things. So, for example, going back to this example of this song, so kind of going back to technique specifically, this is something, like I said, I like to write a melody, and then sometimes I just I like start with the melody, and then first, I'll just decide what bass note is going to accompany that melody before I even come up with a chord. So, again, going back to the little thing that I was doing earlier. Okay, so that's a little phrase. It's a little phrase that I can work with. So now what I like to do, you know, if I like how those two things sound together, is a strong melody. I wouldn't call this a strong melody by any means, but but melodies, you know, that's why we still play a lot of jazz standards, because the melodies of a lot of those standards are so well written and work so well on their own that people 100 years later are still figuring how to do new things with them. It's a really cool groundwork that has been reinvented through generations. You know, the way Miles Davis approached I don't know, If I Were a Bell is very different from the way Bob Berg would approach If I Were a Bell, or, you know, or Brad Meltdown these days would approach If I Were a Bell. So that's a pretty cool thing to do. But it all starts with a wonderful melody. And in a lot of the way those different musicians have changed those songs, they have reharmonized them. So basically, they've just come up with different sets of chord changes to fit a specific sound that they're looking for. That's the easiest way to create variety. So even if you have a simple melody like what I said here, you know, I'm just going to repeat that there. So then I can start filling in the gaps in between. So I can make choices either based on just playing around with it. You know, there's nothing wrong with, you know, I'll just a brief aside, I come from a mostly self-taught background in terms of music before I went to college. So I did play with a lot of bands and everything like that, but a lot of the stuff that I learned was kind of my own doing. And then once I went to college, I started learning more about theory and all that stuff. And the hardest thing for me was that if I couldn't explain something I was playing, even if I knew it sounded good, I felt like I was cheating. And, you know, don't do that to yourself if you ever feel that way, because it's not, music is an oral tradition, first and foremost. It's not, you know, theory came after the sound. The sound was created first, and then people theorize why things work the way they did. So, you know, you can sit down and figure out that the blues can actually be fairly complex in terms of theory or justifying why it sounds good, because there's a lot of wrong notes in traditional theory, but it sounds awesome. So there's that side of things, you know. So you can always learn to justify certain things through theory, and that's kind of what theory really does. Now, I learned to use some theory in order to have some compositional ideas. So, for example, if I have that little melody line, it's a C, D, E flat, and then I'm playing an A flat on the right hand, on the left, on the bass. Then I can pick a chord that fits all those notes. I can do that, which is just an A flat major, or I can play. I'm putting a D on that, creates a little bit more of a crunchy thing. You can play it as a A flat major 7, or I could play it as an A flat 7. Very different sounds. Just kind of cool and open. This is a little bit darker. All I'm changing is one note. I'm lowering the 7th to make it an A flat 7 instead of an A flat major 7. So I love playing with those ideas once I have a melody already, because then the melody just changes in so many different ways. So just to recap kind of what I was saying, being able to play come up with a melody with no context, and then give it context by adding the bass note, and then start filling in the gap in between, so the notes that make up the harmony in the middle and the chord. That's I love working that way. Now there's another way that you can work through it, which is starting with a riff or a line. So I'm gonna play a quick example here. Let me know if this comes true. I think you should be able to hear the sound here. You guys hear that? Cool. So this is a song called Around Here that I wrote for our prior album, for La Lucha Palante. This is a bass line that I came up with first. So this is how that song started, with just that bass line. Then the melody's gonna come in here. But I'm playing it the opposite way. So it's a C major to an A minor. Now I'm playing A minor to C major. So now I'm harmonizing the melody slightly differently because of that. So the melody repeats here. So that little part there where I stopped, it's I actually, so everything before that, the way the melody worked, I really came up with the bass line first, and I did it in a way that I've done some things that I like to. Okay, I have a motive, then I start recording that little thing that I have, and then I start improvising. And I found that's a really cool way to approach it, because even though it's not perfect because I'm improvising, it's taking me in a very natural direction. In other words, it's kind of letting my ear dictate how things are going to develop from there on out. Now, sometimes it develops in a way that I deem too obvious, and I'll shy away from that or change a couple of notes to make it a little bit more interesting. It all depends. But a lot of the times I end up sticking with those ideas, maybe tweaking them a little bit to be more precise with certain things, but I love doing that. So starting with the melody, and I do this when I'm singing onto my phone too, as I mentioned earlier. I'll start, singing a little thing and then let it go. I'll just start singing along with it, try to be away from people so they don't hear me singing to my phone. But it usually, it's been a way that it's worked, and this particular song that I just played kind of worked that way. Now this one, I had the bass line, like I said, before I had the melody. So once I had the bass line and the chord progression, I wrote the melody on top of that, and then that little section in between, I wanted a contrasting section for it. So now the part in the middle, it's kind of interesting because it's just three notes that are repeated. That's all it is. But then I decided to say, like, it would be kind of cool to harmonize each one of those notes differently. And that's what I did on that section. So it kind of creates this moving line that's actually harder than it sounds. And then, so I just went, it was kind of a mixture in between, like, okay, because some people kind of tell me, like, oh, it sounds like it's almost like a rock song when it starts. But then it kind of goes to the part, and some of the chords are a little bit thicker, and it really kind of strays away a little bit from that rock sound. And like I said, I come from a rock background, and at this period in my life, I started saying, you know what, I don't care what type of song I write, I'm just going to write it. Which brings me to the following. And I heard this from Chick Corea, actually, at a masterclass that he did. He said, just write music, start it, finish it, let it be what it is. Don't worry about it. Don't overwork it. Don't tweak it. And there's something to be said for that. I mean, well, if Chick Corea says it, he must be right. I would not doubt that. And I found out, yes, I mean, Chick has kind of done something really cool that is not exactly what I've done applied the way he's done it. Like, he's done a few different arrangements of Spain, for example. And a lot of his songs, depending on the band that he's playing with, it's really cool. He kind of reinvents them. He doesn't really change the structure of the composition as it is. You can still tell it's the melody and all that stuff. Now, sometimes what I like to do is that I'll come up with a melody or a song in its most simple form, and I won't really decide if it's going to be a specific style or what it's going to be. I try to just kind of stick to, okay, I have this melody, this is kind of the tempo that I hear it at, and then I've been going back to arrange it. And this is where the guys from La Lucha helped me with a lot, because their perception is going to be very different from my perception. So it's really cool, because then, we'll play something, and as when you're writing music, you may end up hearing the same phrase over and over and over, and it gets simplified in your head, or you get used to it. But to a person that's listening for the first or second time, it may be too complex, or it may not make as much sense. And that's why it's good to have feedback from other people that you trust, to tell you, hey, that phrase is kind of awkward, and then you can go back and rewrite it. I mean, you want people to like your composition, but you also want to be able to speak to your what comes out of your heart, and if it's something that's too if it's something you really feel strongly about, then stick with it. Don't doubt yourself. But I think it's very important to create, to constantly create. And what I mean by that is, don't expect to write a great song right off the bat. Write a few songs, right? If something comes along, that album that I was playing, Palante, I actually ended up writing a lot. There's, I think 4 or 5 of my songs in that album, and a lot of that just came out through. I set myself the boundary. I said, I am not going to rewrite these songs. I'm just gonna write what comes out, and then arrange it later with the guys. But for the most part, the melodic and harmonic content is going to be what it is. So, and that's pretty much what made it onto the record, which was really cool, because it was the first time that I forced myself to do that, and I didn't try to be hip. Because that's also the other issue, when I'm like, oh, I'm writing jazz, it needs to be hip, it needs to be modern, it needs to be that. So, well, who says it has to be that? You're the one that's deciding what it needs to be. So for me, that's the other thing. I said, I can't tell you how many compositions I stopped halfway through because I said, like, this sounds like a pop song, or, oh, this is too poppy, or oh, this is stupid, But I wish I would have just stuck around with some of those. I mean, some of them I've found, like, old finale files where I hear it back. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm glad I didn't finish this. And there's some of them that are like, oh, let me finish this, So again, there's no somebody, I think it was Bob Minzer said like, just put the pen on the paper, just basically do it. That's the best way to really start writing music. Just do it and trusting what you're hearing. Again, if you're in the early stages of doing that, or really at any stage, it's good to have feedback from your fellow musicians. I had the privilege actually of, we played the Clearwater Jazz Holiday, maybe 3 years ago, and we had Marty Morell and Jeff Rupert as guests with La Lucha, and Michiko, Marty's wife, who's an incredible percussionist, and they played our compositions. And it was nerve-wracking, because these are incredible musicians, and we're like, oh, is this composition good enough? So the best thing about it was to hear the feedback from them. So like, oh, I really like this composition. I dig this and all that. So that, for example, that gave me a lot of confidence for our latest album, Everybody Wants to Rule the World, where we were, we had Ken Peplowski, Diego Figueiredo, Houston Person, Melissa Aldana, and I'm forgetting. Did I say no? And Chuck Red, yes. We had all those people be guests in our albums, and a lot of the songs were originals, and it was nerve-wracking to bring it to them because these were brand new compositions. We really hadn't sat on them very long, and we were able to do that. So I'm going to play a little bit of one of those compositions. This was called Por la Tarde, which is very different from the one I just played. And this one features Diego Figueiredo and Ken Peplowski. I'm gonna skip forward a little bit, and I'll talk about it in a second. So I'm gonna completely improvise guitar intro by Diego. Sorry, I left it playing. I should have started a little bit later, but the that's the first time I've written something like that, and oddly enough, it came out very quickly. It's based on a Colombian style called bambuco, and I've always wanted to kind of write a song based on that style. And I don't remember what triggered it, but this name of the song is called Por la Tarde, and which means in the afternoon, and which is how long it took me to write the song. It just kind of came out, and it's weird because I played it on the bass, on the electric bass. Is actually how that song came about, and that's certainly not a bass line. So obviously the bass, I was playing the bass in a very melodic way, but my intention was never really to make it the bass playing the melody. It's just the instrument I was holding at the time that it came out. And then, as you could hear, I adapted it for the piano and the clarinet to play the melody kind of back and forth. And that's a very different style. It's a very different thing, but it's a bambuco kind of has a little bit of a classical sound in it. But it's a 3/4 rhythm or a 6/8 kind of rhythm. And that one for me, once I had the melody, the harmony was very easy for me to kind of think about, but it was too obvious. So I wanted to change things a little bit. So I had that opening line. I can't play it on keyboards. I'm not a keyboard player, so that little line, originally it just sounded like it should be on a C minor. Right? But I just said, well, let me just do the major version. It kind of gives it a little different sound, and it said everything from then on in a very different way. But that was an example of what I was talking about. Said, okay, here's the obvious thing that my ear is hearing. How can I come up with something that's a little bit different, that's not going to be that obvious thing that my ear is hearing? And like I said, that's just what I trust my ear. I don't know what the listener is going to do with that information. It may sound completely natural to them. But you can make little choices like that and make change things around a little bit. And again, this was a melody that half of it was kind of it worked out, and then the other half was an improvisation. So I kind of followed that pattern. And again, I think I was looking at a video of, I don't remember, I saw somebody playing something that just kind of triggered this melody in my head, and when I started playing, and that's kind of how it happened, So yes, sometimes inspiration strikes you when you least expect it, and you have the opportunity to take advantage of it. And yes, I would definitely say, if you, like I said, sometimes just pick up the phone, record on it, and that's it. I think I've heard a lot of composers, like Pat Metheny said, like he will be on a plane someplace and he will actually do that, So that's a very commonly used thing. And there's really no, like I said at the beginning, there's no right or wrong way to write a song, Sometimes if you're writing in a specific style, for example, the lyrics are more important. I'm not really a songwriter in terms of like a song with lyrics. I can't write a lyric to save my life. So I write a lot of melodies, but and that's why I stick mostly to instrumental stuff. But I do try to think sometimes, what if somebody wanted to put lyrics to this? Is this doable? Is this something that would actually fit? Am I writing something that a vocalist would be able to sing, or would it be too awkward? Is this just something that you can play on an instrument where you don't have the limitations of the voice, which is cool to do as well, but it's also cool to say like, hey, if somebody wants to sing it, great. So there's a lot of little different parameters and kind of things that you can set up for yourself in terms of what you want to do. And I find that's a really cool thing. I think it's good to just sit down and write, see where things take you if you have the time. That's a great way to do it, and it's also a great way to edit a lot of things. Some stuff that I've written before has come to me in like hearing two parts at the same time, so kind of hearing almost like a contrapuntal bass line with a melody, and those things were kind of hard to to write out in the struggle with those is that since I was hearing two parts at the same time, it was hard to get a good flow through the song, and that's why I kind of started try to stick with the melody first, because I found myself having to spend more time writing each like two bars at a time of two parts at the same time, and then at that point I'm more kind of arranging as I'm going as well. So to kind of recap, if some melody pops in your head, record it or try to play it. You can use notation software if you want to. I've done that as well, where I have an idea, I just try to notate it out before I forget. I find that recording it is better. And being an improviser is kind of hard too, because it's hard to stick to a very specific idea. So sometimes I figure like I need to repeat something over and over so I'm consistent with the rhythm and all that stuff, and not play the phrasing different every time. So write that out, or record it in some way. Give yourself the space to improvise, and after that, see where it takes you. See if it wants to take you somewhere naturally, and don't be afraid to challenge. Two things. It's kind of weird. Don't be afraid if it sounds too vanilla, but it feels right. Let it be what it is. But also don't be afraid to challenge yourself if you feel you can do a little bit better. But I would say don't beat a dead horse. I think that's when you can let it rest, let your ears rest, and come back to it where you're like, oh, okay, yeah, this sounds way different now, because that happens, and so those two things, I think, find that balance, find a way to do it. I mean, in the words of Chick Corea, don't feel like you have to rewrite everything in order to, don't go back to your old songs and try to make them better. Those songs are already what they are. He's rearranged. I mean, Chick Corea does not need to improve on Spain, but he just likes to keep it new for himself because he knows it's one of the songs that people request the most. So it's amazing that he has that mentality of being able to, and plays with great musicians that are kind of able to do a lot of that stuff in the spot. So, but it shows the quality of his compositions as well. That's the other thing. See if the melody by itself makes sense. If it's a strong melody that doesn't really need a lot of support from other things in order to make sense to the listener. I know there's a lot of modern jazz composers that like to take a sound, maybe of a mode, or specific scale or a sound, and they like to write tunes based around that. And I think you can make it work, but a lot of the times I personally, as a listener, feel like, there's no substance there. And, and I'm just making up the way some of these composers, I'm assuming that's how they're approaching some of this stuff. And not everybody's a great songwriter, it's just what it is too, so people, I'm not saying I'm a good songwriter, I'm not, I try to do what I do. We're all just trying to express ourselves with what we can say. So that's the most important thing, that you are able to put your signature on what it is that you're writing. To me, that's the ultimate goal. That people hear your music and be like, oh, that's Alejandro. Like Monk, you can tell it's Monk from a mile away, and that's the thing. I remember reading an interview of Monk saying, I don't remember where I read it, but he said that his goal was to be able to write music his peers would have fun with and respect, but that the listener could have fun listening to as well. And man, I think Monk kind of achieved that, as awkward as a lot of his stuff was. Like, he wrote some of the catchiest melodies, but they're also like, some of his songs are hard to play, for different reasons. But, there's a lot of different ways to approach songwriting, and don't feel like you're doing something wrong because it doesn't fit a specific parameter. I think you develop your own things, and having different ways to do it is perfectly fine. Like I said, every composer will tell you they write in different ways. I think that's I think I've talked enough.
And I
Could
could
talk
listen to
about this
you. I
forever.
could listen to you talk for a long time, Alejandro. I thought that
Thank you.
was a really, really great session. I have a question that come to mind that sort of, we have a lot of young jazz students that follow the Clearwater Jazz Holiday tradition or participate in outreach programs like the Young Lions event that we do. And
Yes.
there many of them are to a point where they're beginning to creatively at least attempt to create some original material or collaborate with each other. And I
Hmm.
was wondering if you could touch on your experience of the dynamic of the group creative process and any advice that you might lend to people that are just starting out to share with each other and try to create something together. I'm wondering, even as I'm asking the question about your own processes, how much do you invest in that before you share it with your colleagues, and what's their role in creating the final product?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the hardest. I've played music with some people that bring everything written out. Like basically I'm just interpreting the bass line that they wrote for me, and there's very little space for me to say what I would like to say, and that's fine. If somebody has that strong of a vision of something that should be that way, I'm not going to. I'm going to play it. I'm going to interpret it the best way that I can. From my perspective, I love when there's music that allows the musicians to interpret things their own way, and interpreting in terms of like giving them more freedom with what they're creating. That's the way I like to work. That's the way I work with La Lucha, for example, and even when I work with other groups, I try to, I've worked with drummers that love to have a drum part, and I've worked with drummers that say like, just tell me, just show me the melody, you know. There's drummers that love that tell me, give me very specific what you want and I'll do it, or just give me the melody, I'll be fine, you know. So there's both sides, and I don't think one side's better than the other. I do think that as a composer, if you have a very strong a very strong view of how something should sound, do go through the effort to provide the musicians with the best representation of what that sound in your head is. So, meaning if you have to, if you really want the drummer to write something, you may have to learn to write some really good drum parts, or have a good, really good recorded reference, because sometimes in the jazz world you'll say like, hey, play this thing like Elvin, and if you have a young drummer that doesn't know who Elvin Jones is, there's no way that he's going to play it unless he naturally plays like Elvin, which is very unlikely. So I think, yes, if you have a very strong view of what it should be, then be organized with this. So bring the charts that with every part that you want, the musicians to play. Now, I will say, as a musician, I usually have more fun with the parts that give me a little bit of freedom, because I feel like I can make the song my own. Like it's not like if they just put another bass player, nobody's going to tell that Alejandro's not playing at it anymore, or that it's not me. Sorry, I didn't mean to refer to myself in the third person, but you know what I mean. Like it can be X bass player and nobody really knows who it is. Not that I have to put my stamp on everything I play on either. Again, balance. My advice, for young musicians is that if you are surrounded by musicians that you trust, give them the space to say what they have to say within your music. I do that with Mark Feynman, the drummer for La Lucha. Sometimes I'll say like, hey, can you catch this thing here? Maybe on 2 songs out of 10 years that or more than 10 years we've played together, I'll tell him, here's the groove, but he still, he still has space to create his own thing. Same thing with John on piano. He said, well, I'm not a piano player. I'm never going to create anything nearly as cool as what John has to have. So I need to figure out how to communicate that idea that I have to John that way that he can interpret it in a certain way. And that involves knowing the instrument to a certain extent. With the way we work, in terms of being, well, and the other thing too that's hard is the ego, because you bring something in, you think it's good, and then you get negative feedback or constructive feedback, and you may feel like, well, you just don't understand it or whatever. I think, yes, sometimes people may not get the music that you're writing. That's perfectly fine. But, I think it's good to look at yourself and say, like, okay, how can I make this? Well, first of all, are these the right musicians? And second, how can I make this what it is? How can I make this more understandable to people that are outside my head? And that's the other thing. Jazz can get very cerebral very quickly because we're jazz nerds, and we can get carried away with certain things that we say, like, this sounds so cool to us, but the audience is like, what is going on? That can happen. So it's good to find, now more than ever, we're realizing we really need audiences. So finding that balance, like Monk said, like I quoted him. And yes, I think my advice would be, do take advantage of the places where you can use as a workshop. We actually did a concert with a couple of Rudecker Hall students, former Rudecker Hall students, Dylan McCann and Megan Locke, and we wanted to feature their compositions as well. And that was very cool because they brought really mature stuff. They were really open to feedback from us, and we wanted them to be able to say what they had to say beyond just playing the instrument, and that was very cool. They brought some really cool tunes, and they were very open to that feedback and very open, especially those two, Dylan and Meg. They've gone to all the jam sessions. They're always involved in the community, and do it. I mean, that's the beyond that. Mingus used to have a workshop. Charles Mingus used to have a workshop where he would bring his music and have a lot of musicians bring their own music too. And they would just work on it and criticize each other and help each other out with a lot of that stuff. So it would be great, to create stuff like that around. And, you young people that have the energy, spearhead that movement. It's really important to be able to have that community for sure. I don't know if that, so the long answer for a lot of that stuff. I think I covered some of the ground there, but
yeah, no, I think it addressed it head on, and it was a great answer. So
thank you.
I think we did a good job today, and when I say we, I mean you. So thank you for being a continued part of these sessions as we develop these really great resources for people. And look forward, Alejandro, to you coming back with us for the Harmony of Bass Perspective session on August 25th, which will be your next one. And then the Fun with Arranging, reimagining existing composition on September 1st. So until we meet again, thanks for everything, Alejandro. Thanks for everyone out there who's been supporting the Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation and helping to support our education and outreach. And that's been really inspiring and rewarding to see as we develop these things together. So on behalf of the foundation and everyone, stay safe out there, be well, and keep playing, everybody.
Yeah, thank you guys.
All right, take care, Alejandro.